Today we're speaking with Bryan Lile. He's an architectural and environmental photographer in Northeast Ohio. David has traveled the world as a photographer and had his work commissioned by companies such as Price Waterhouse Cooper, Summa Health Systems, and Interstate Gas Supply. His work has been exhibited in numerous facilities around northeastern Ohio and also placed in transportation hubs such as the Cleveland, Akron, and Columbus airports. David shares with us new ways to experience our environment, what it means to be an artistic professional, and just how to keep our creative fires burning. It's great having you here, so thank you so much for joining us here at the Cuyahoga Valley Art Center. I know when we talked the first time, you mentioned you had a little bit of history in this space, specifically with a prior photography club. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what your experience was in this space and why it's a meaningful space to you. About
8 or 9 years ago, I got involved in my photography. And I had about 10 images, and I came to an Akron Camera Club with one of my images in a black attaché, and I had a friend here, and Kate said, show them one of your images. And so I pulled it out and brought it up front here in this very room, and everybody was like, wow, that's quite interesting. Now remember, that's 8 or 9 years ago from 2018. Not everybody in the camera club understood my work. Some of them did, and I appreciated it. Those that didn't, I didn't have a problem with that, but I kept moving forward. And once a year in the spring, they had exhibits. And that was the first time I ever exhibited any of my work in a formal public setting. So this room really does hold a lot of memories for me right now. But it was quite interesting because when you have a vision sometimes, people don't understand your vision, but if you know in your heart that you have a viable product, you have a product that can be viewed, a product that can be considered, you just forge on. How were your first images taken when you showed them? What were they of, and what did people think of those first few shots? Well, if I may back up a little, I'll tell you how I started from the very beginning. I had a next door neighbor, and everybody always thinks, oh, he had angels come down and say, be a photographer. It wasn't really quite that way. I had a neighbor across the street that worked for the city of Cuyahoga Falls, and he was cleaning out his garage. He had every kind of doodad. He cleaned out his garage one day, and it was a week after my daughter Amy had sold me actually my first digital camera, because she's a professional photographer also. And I went over to Jim's, my neighbor's, and started shooting. I shot air pressure gauges. I shot paneling. I shot pegboard. I shot all kinds of things. I shot drawers that he had stacked up in weird ways that had metal in them. And I thought, this is fantastic. I love this. So I went home, and that's when I had the rudimentary Photoshop at that time, and I started playing around with it. And interestingly enough, one of those images, the air pressure gauge, is at Interstate Gas Supply in Columbus, and it's about 7 feet by 4 feet large, split up in panels in their main multi-million-dollar headquarters. And that was the first shots I ever shot, so that was quite interesting. So to get to your question, what kind of photos were they? They were photos of fire hydrants. They were photos of railroad crossings. And they were photos of normal, everyday life. I say I breathe life into the otherwise inanimate with my work. And ever since I was in Jim's driveway, I've done that. Whether I've gone to a city like Cincinnati or Las Vegas or Europe, in Morzine or Turin, Italy, I still have that concept of bringing life to the otherwise inanimate.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned bringing life to otherwise inanimate objects as well as showing everyday life. Because I know not only have you done images where you have drawers and fire hydrants and things like that, but you also transition some of that to architecture. So buildings, civic spaces, public spaces, things like that. Why do you think it's important to show the everyday life in those types of scenes and inanimate objects and cityscapes?
With my photography, I like people to think they see things in a different way. Look, I always tell people, look all around you, art is everywhere, and it really is. But have people look at their space, their environmental space, in a different way. And with my architectural work, I try to shoot unusual angles and then add vibrancy to that and add life, as it were, to that, and have it seen in a way that they've never seen a work of architecture.
Before you got into photography and had that camera and started taking pictures, did you have any inclinations to doing art at all? Were you a painter or say a pencil drawing? Did anything like that spark your interest, or was photography the first jump that got you into art?
Actually, my dad was a filmmaker with Goodyear, and my dad shot all the film in the 1960s for their commercials. And I will say this to you, being a professional, it was film. And I'm the oldest out of 6 children, and Dad would take me down to the audiovisual department in Goodyear and show me the drying racks where they dried the film. So I come from a photographic father. I guess by the DNA, the photographic DNA doesn't fall far from the tree, and I come by it naturally, but I was just involved in art, and then I would shoot with his Argus C3 camera, and then I got my own Canon AE1 and shot with that. I started shooting barns, and mostly barns and kind of rough buildings, which kind of segued into Jim's driveway when I shot all those unusual pieces.
I know I've heard you speak at length before about what it takes to be a professional in this industry. Because so many people have the ability to go out and buy a camera, it's like, well, if you have $3,000, you can buy a nice camera and a lens, and now you're a photographer. But that doesn't make you a photographer because you're lacking the mindset, you're lacking the discipline, and I would think so many other traits that it takes to actually operate in this space. From your perspective and in your experience, what does it take to operate as a professional in a creative space like photography?
Well, I really like that question a lot. I think that photography is in tandem with, quote unquote, being an artist, but so often being an artist is being irresponsible and living your own life and feeling like giving out your art when you want to. But if you really want to grow as a professional, you have to be a professional. Simple things. When people email you, you email them back. When they want a certain picture, you say, well, what do you want? And you communicate clearly with people. With me working with interior designers and architects now, they are very busy people, and they expect you to be professional. They expect you to have a product, they expect you to deliver that product or have the digital image sent to the proper place when it's supposed to be done, and complete the project. Many artists don't believe in that. And I think that from beginning to end, you have to be professional. And when you meet people initially, you have to respect their time and their position and what they want from you. So I think with different projects I've been in, I've been different things to different people. When I was at Summit Artspace and they asked about a solo exhibit, I got back with them right away. I sent samples down to them, and they said, we've never dealt with a photographer / artist like you. And I said, why? And they said, well, I don't know, but you're very responsible. I think you have to be responsible. I also think that you have to have a viable product, not only in your mind, but marketing-wise in the mind of the public, in the eye of the public. So I think there's a lot to presenting yourself to other professionals such as architects and interior designers.
I know in thinking of professionalism, I've heard you say something before which I find profound, but you made the comment that you have to know what you can do and then do that. Just because you can do something, it doesn't mean you should do something.
Right.
So I'm wondering, where did you hear that phrase, and can you give us a rundown of what that means to you in your artwork?
My daughter told me one time, and I love this, "Dad, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something." I write too many exclamation marks at the end of my sentence, and she always lets me know that. And so I can write copy. I've written good copy, but I always have to run it by her because I want a professional to do it. But as far as my photography, I don't shoot wedding photography. I can shoot beautiful landscape photography, but that's not my thing, although I have shared it on Facebook and Instagram. My main love is environmental, and by environmental, I mean spaces, and usually urban spaces, and architectural. And that's where I've kind of focused my work. They don't go to me for shooting ducks in a beautiful lake in a landscape setting, but they say, I love his architectural work. And that's how I think that you get known, because you cannot be all things to all men with everything. I'd rather be a 10 plus than if I, as an architectural and environmental photographer, rather than a 7 or 8 plus as a landscape photographer shooting mountains. So people know I'm a go-to person in those areas, and it really does help shine a light on your talent. And it causes remembrance of them, of what I do.
Because you've shot so much, and the urban space as well as the architectural space, what do you try to leave your audience with who sees your work?
I think it's really important, once they view my work, to start thinking about their surroundings. And I think it allows them to see things they've never seen before, because that's my goal. And I've even shot shots of doorbells. In Columbus, I shot a doorbell, and somebody really liked that. It was a close-up of a doorbell on a 10-story building, but I shot the doorbell. Why? Because it was a very interesting doorbell. My focus and hope is that those people will take the time to not only look at the 10-story building, but they'll say, wow, look at this really cool doorbell. Because not many people do that. They walk fast, they talk fast, they move fast. Everything is fast and done, but people don't think about their surroundings.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that concept, because I know in architectural training, we're taught to look at both the micro view as well as the macro view. So you're not just looking at the whole plan of the building, but you've got to design it in such a way that conceptually it works with the window mullions and that it works with the details on the facade. And so you're constantly jumping back and forth between this big overall vision and zeroing in on the minute detail. And I know in my experience, so many people walk by the details, they don't see it. You may look at the building and say, okay, this is a building, here's a door, I go in, but you don't actually appreciate the small things that are around you all the time. One reason why I think your work is particularly powerful, because it opens up people's vision to some of those smaller spaces or to those objects that they may not otherwise notice. So it's interesting that you bring that point out.
And I appreciate that. And I've shot alleys in Cleveland that people have really liked. They said, where is that? That's in the warehouse district. I never noticed it. My daughter was actually shooting a wedding, and she was in the warehouse district. And this is a number of years ago, but it's interesting you say that, because she was in the warehouse district with a couple, and she was shooting them after the wedding. And it was in one of the hotels there in Cleveland, and they walked out, and Amy stopped. And that was one of my first images, my first group, maybe the first 2 years of images. And Amy stopped, and they said, why are you stopping? And she said, that's the spot that my father shot. It was the alley. And she looked at the crosswalks, and she called me up and said, Dad, I saw the alley there in the warehouse district. One of your first shots. I said, that's awesome. But here again, it goes back to what we've been talking about, and that's what touches my heart, truly touches my heart. My daughter embraced that concept of always being aware of her surroundings. And I think that's so important. I think that's so important because it enriches your life and allows you to see things and be aware of things and knowledgeable of things that you had never seen before.
Now, I wanted to ask you about some of your treatments on the images that you present, because I've seen a range of photography from you, some, these beautiful architectural spaces and images of buildings, but then also at various times you'll overlay, say, a color pattern or some sort of grade on the space or the image, and it almost looks like you're highlighting a certain element in the picture or an element of a building and really zeroing in on that. So I'm wondering, where did the inspiration for that sort of color treatment come from, and why do you apply it on some images?
One of my goals is to almost make the picture look 3D. I can't always do that because of the depth of the picture or what I'm shooting. But I try to make it almost look 3D where people go, wow, if you look at it just right, it looks like there's two different layers in that picture even looking at it, just straight on. And that's one of my goals. But I just felt in the scope of my work that I didn't want to just shoot architecture. Everybody shoots architecture. I just wanted to do something different. And again, I felt from the very beginning in my heart, and I can even say in my soul, I felt that it was so important to have that extra element within my photography, to have the wow factor. I have a very good friend and a mentor that I knew from my old church, and he called it the it factor. And we've talked about it a number of years ago. He called it the it factor. He said, people look at an image, they may look for 30 seconds at an image, but when you look for a minute and a half at an image, it tells you something that they're looking at and in the image. And I had a Beacon Journal writer that viewed my work at Summit Artspace at that exhibit that I had shared earlier. And she said, I'm not looking at it, I'm looking in it. And I thought that was a really wonderful compliment, and I appreciated it. But again, I want people to really view my images. That's my goal. One of my main goals is to have them view the images.
And I think one thing I've noticed with some of the color mapping or the heat mapping that you put on some of the elements, I think it really does draw attention to certain aspects of a building or an industrial space or an urban space that, as you've been talking about, it makes you view that space in a different way, some way that people wouldn't have before. But I am curious because you mentioned you're not really a landscape photographer, you're not really a suburban photographer, but mostly an urban photographer. That was a conscious decision at a point, and I'm wondering what went into that decision to say, I want to focus on cities or urban environments the most. Was that just always an interest of yours?
Basically, I just was really drawn to cities. I love the energy of the city. I have shared that I feel that cities are living beings also, and they actually have a soul of some sort, and they have an ethnicity mixture, and they have different regions of the city that are known for different things. For example, jazz in Chicago, you have the jazz section, and they have their own food, and they have everything, but a city is not just people. I think cities are people that create different areas of the city, and I find that fascinating. I mean, when you shoot a landscape shot, and my work's on Facebook and Instagram, when I shoot a landscape shot, it's beautiful, but there's not a lot of ways you can change that. I don't like to change landscape because green grass saturated becomes greener grass, and it looks unusual. But when you shoot architecture and you make it different and you add greens and blues and then you add a whole different texture on it, it looks amazing. But
I'm sure the architects hate that.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, everything they created, I kind of change around, so that's okay.
You mentioned cities. You see a lot of different cities have souls, and they have, people, there's energy, there's so much life in something like that. In your opinion, what is one of the best ways to experience a city? And that could be any given city or a place you want to go and visit. What's the best way to experience that?
I take my bicycle because I'm an avid bicyclist. I take my bicycle and literally cycle the city. Stop here, cycle, stop, cycle, stop, cycle, stop. I went with a lifelong friend, and we went down to Cincinnati and spent 2 days down there. But in 2 days, we rode 26 miles in the city. We covered everything: the History Museum, along the river, the Steamboat Memorial, the stadiums, the football and the baseball stadiums. But we were on bikes, and we just really shot the city. Whether it was the fountain in the city center square in Cincinnati, or shooting in Nashville with all the construction in Nashville and all the amazing energy in Nashville. I rode my bike there too, and rode over 30 miles in Nashville in 3 days. I rode about 10 miles a day in Nashville. So it's an awesome way to see a city. But of course, when I shoot, I go into a different mode. I go into a photographic mode. And when I'm on vacation, I really have to watch it with my wife, Kathy, of 43 years, because I'm with her as my loving wife. I'm not there to shoot. But when she's not with me, I get centered on myself, and it's kind of a Zen thing. You become one with a camera and you just shoot. That's the best way to describe it. And I'm not a hard person to communicate with while I'm shooting if needs be, but I'm primarily focused on my photography. And it's really an awesome way to see a city when you're a photographer. When you're with a family, it's a little harder.
I try to develop strategies in order to drag the family along and shoot at the same time, and invariably my son will say, "Daddy, you got it, let's go."
We actually were supposed to go to Italy this year, and we had to cancel, and we're probably going to go in the fall. But I came down to the knowledge that I was not going to take my 5D Mark III. I was going to take my Samsung S9 camera because of that very reason: family. And when you're with family, it's very, very, very important to be with family, especially when they're young. When Amy and I shoot together, my older daughter, we have fun. But when you're with family or a wife and you're in a special area, you're there because it's a special area, no matter where it is in the world, and you're not there to shoot. If I would go back, I would be a totally different person if I was alone in Italy compared to being with my wife.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I know when you're doing photography or in a business, there's always ups and downs. There's good times, bad times. And I remember you telling me a story about your health personally and how that had sparked many artistic thoughts and some of the creativity inside of you. And I understand you're a survivor of leukemia, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that story and how that came about and how that's ended up affecting you as an artist, sort of moving forward in your photography.
In 5 days from today will be a decade of me being alive after being diagnosed. My wife, Kathy, thought I looked anemic in some wedding photos. It was a wedding photo booth, and with me being a photographer, I said, "Honey, that's the worst kind of photography you can have." She said, "I know, but you look anemic." I said, "Okay." So she convinced me to go to a doctor, and the bottom line is a physician assistant took some extra tests that she did not have to take, and on the night of Christmas Eve, I got a call at 10 o'clock at night that same day, and they said, "David, we'd like you to come to the hospital. There's a team of doctors waiting." Okay, that's quite a rude awakening in one's life. And so I even drove the car down. I had no idea what was going to happen. And the next day I was diagnosed with leukemia. Normal white blood cell count is about 12,000 when you're very, very sick. My white blood cell count was 195,000, and I did not even know it. And I have chronic myelogenic leukemia. It's called CML, and I have what's called the Philadelphia chromosome. It's 2 chromosomes that switch, and they make white blood cells. And they say, keep making white blood cells, so that makes them leukemic. I take Sprycel, a pharmaceutical that was created by 3 people the whole course of their lives, and that has brought my white blood cell count down to normal. And I actually have a FISH test every 6 months, and it's an atomic level test that shows the building blocks of blood. That's an XY grid, and it shows no discernible data, and that is amazing. So I'm very thankful to God for, I believe through His Spirit, giving my wife insight, saying you look anemic, because I would have never known. And I'm thankful for my medical team and the creators of Sprycel. I'm very thankful on a number of levels of life, and I'm thankful to God for allowing me to live 10 years from December 24th on, and this year is 10 years. So in all of that, I say that I had just started shooting my photography a little tiny bit before that, but when I was diagnosed with my leukemia, it just changed of sorts. My concepts changed, and I thought, I can make anything as vibrant as I want. And I truly try to live life to the max every day. I'm 65 years old. I'm thankful. I've skied in the slopes of Europe and the French and Swiss Alps. I've ridden my bike 100 miles a few years ago. But I'm very grateful to live each and every day, photographically, with my family, with my life, with my Lord. I'm just very thankful. I'm very, very grateful.
I'm sure as just an overall mindset, going through something like that has got to give you a tremendous amount of hope and inspiration that, you know, when something like that happens, you can still bounce back. And I mean, you could have gotten down in the dumps and gone in a very different direction with your life. Well, but instead, it seems like you've taken it in a much more positive direction.
The doctor told us that if it had been 3 weeks more, I probably would have died, because the cells go up algorithmically and they can't stop it. So I'm, again, very thankful.
That's an amazing story. Ever since then, I mean, life is looking up and looking good.
Pretty good. Looking pretty good. Pretty thankful.
In your practice, doing the shooting that you are, not only can the health trials come up, but I'm sure there are other setbacks that can come up in terms of, you know, whether it's selling artwork or other challenges that you have to go through when having your own business or being a shooter like that. So I'm wondering, can you share any pertinent examples from your past that you remember of setbacks that you've been faced with?
There's been years where I haven't sold as much photography. There's been years where I've sold quite a lot and been very thankful with some major corporate projects, such as my Price Waterhouse project up in Cleveland. It's not all roses, but yet you keep pressing forward. And so I tell people, well, when they ask me honestly, I say, honestly, I didn't sell as much artwork this year as I did last year, but I also had a wonderful marketing year. I received the Canton Score Business Client of the Year a few weeks ago, and that was quite an honor. I and 3 other recipients out of over 500 clients from the Canton Score group that help you with business and business plans. So some years you have marketing years and growth in marketing and exposure, and then other years you have selling, and sometimes they're all balanced. But you have to just keep believing in your product. And that's hard. That's faith sometimes, because you have to believe in yourself, in your talent, in your skill set, and in your work. And you have to believe that you know how to get that to your client, in what ways you can get it to your client, and try and make some money from it.
Seeing that you've been doing this for as long as you have, is there any advice that you would give to somebody who is just starting out in photography or a creative endeavor like you have, what kind of advice would you give someone who is just starting?
One thing I was interviewed with in Atlanta was, they said, how can artists change? Well, I think artists can change in being professional. But I also think that the nation can change in honoring artists by paying them. Because I've always said that CEOs get paid, airplane pilots get paid, janitors get paid, teachers get paid, taxi cab drivers get paid, but when your work is going to be shown, we're going to give you great exposure. And exposure means you're not going to get paid. And I think it's up to the artist to say, my work's not being shown unless I get paid for it. And I understand that when it's in like an art gallery, it may or may not be bought. But if it is, they get paid. I understand that, but I'm talking about corporations that encourage people to get their art in their foyer, but they don't want to pay them. I think it's horrible.
Absolutely. I think it's a valid point, and I'm sure a lot of artists can struggle with that side of things because it's a different part of the brain, but it's very important to do it.
I think that the artist will have more self-esteem when they make people pay than say, I'll do it for exposure.
How do you find that you stay creative and engaged in your own product creatively, having done it for 10 years?
I think it's a matter of the soul and spirit, because you have to know with a passion, living life with a passion, both in your art and in your life and in everything that you believe in. You have to have passion, and you have to have a core experience and a core knowledge. And I hate using the word product all the time, but with my pieces, you have to believe in yourself, and you have to understand, I have to keep pushing out. And for example, this year I was involved in a lot of things, but I didn't shoot as much as I usually do over the course of the summer and the fall. But nonetheless, I've pulled some of my thousands of raw images up that have not been produced yet, and I've been producing those. So when I can't shoot, and I don't shoot all the time, I shoot more specifically now, because I don't shoot families, as I said, or capture weddings or anything like that. But I will take old images that I've never even done before and produce those. But I always try to, as you said, stay creative and keep the fire burning. Because once the fire goes out and you say, I'm done, it's out. And it takes a lot to relight a fire. So I always try to keep in my soul and my spirit, keep my creative fire burning, literally, and growing.
I appreciate those comments. It is a struggle to continue with something despite the difficulties or challenges or your own mind, frankly.
It's just an everyday experience. Whether I work in my other part-time job to help with my health costs and things like that, or whether I'm actually involved in photography directly, it's an everyday sojourn of my life and journey of my life to keep that fire burning.
This has been a great conversation, David, and I really appreciate your time. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about your work, where can they go and do that?
I will give you 3 different areas. On my website is that's my old radio days, www.davidblile.com. So that's www.davidblile.com. My email address is david@davidblile.com. And I'm also on Instagram. I have quite a following on Instagram. I'm #DavidBryanLile. So that's #DavidBryanLile. So that's how they can contact me, and I appreciate you asking me that.
Appreciate your time, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.